Are we live yet? How will I tell whether we're live?
I believe we are live, yes.
Okay.
Attendees are coming in, so which means we are live. So I will introduce the sayers and then introduce you.
Okay.
I'll wait a minute. All right, we should get started. I'd like to welcome all of you to the first lecture of the annual lecture series at the Center for Philosophy of Science. The annual lecture series will be online this semester and possibly for the whole year. Before introducing today's speaker, I wanted to make two announcements. The first one is that the next ALS lecture will be given by Stéphanie Ruffy from the École Normale Supérieure in France. And the topic will be science policies and the unpredictability of scientific inquiry. Notice that her talk will be at 11 a.m. the morning instead of the usual 3:30 the afternoon, mostly because she's in France and given the 6 hours difference, 11 a.m. was actually a much better time for her. You can register for this talk by going to our website under the events part of the website if you're interested in Stéphanie's lecture. Also, the next event at the center is on Tuesday. It's a lunch talk, part of the lunchtime talk series. And it's going to be given by Yolanda Wilson. And she will be talking about empathy and structural injustice in the assessment of patient non-compliance. I wanted also to remind you about the mechanics of this meeting. You might be familiar with Zoom meetings, but we're using Zoom webinar. Most of you are attendees at this point, so we cannot see you. And only Liz and I are panelists at this time. So where the Q&A is going to work is that if you have a question, go to the bottom of your screen and click on Q&A. If you click on Q&A, you'll see a box and you can just input your name, you can just write down your name, and then I'll promote you to the status of panelist. And then you can ask your question to Liz directly. And the list of people on this box will serve as a question list for Liz's talk. All right, so I hope it's clear enough about how it works. In any case, I'll remind you after the lecture about how to proceed. It's very simple. Go to the bottom, click on Q&A, input your name if you've got a question, and then I'll promote you to panelists. And today, it's really my great pleasure to introduce Liz Schechter. Liz got her PhD from the University of Maryland. She's now an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at Indiana University, Bloomington. Associate.
Yeah.
So your CV is a bit out of date.
Oh.
or there's a mistake on your CV.
My bad.
Or there's a mistake on your CV. Actually, I saw that it was associate, and somehow okay, my bad. I apologize. Liz is associate professor at the Department of Philosophy. She's extremely well known for her very important work on brain split patients and the relation between brain split patients and consciousness. Indeed, she has written one of the best books in the philosophy of cognitive science of the last 10 to 15 years, Self-Consciousness and Split Brains, The Mind's Eye, where I is written just I. And that's published in 2018 with OUP. It's really a very important book in the field of philosophy of cognitive science. And I highly recommend it if you haven't read it yet. And today, Liz is going to be talking about self-consciousness after split brain surgery. Liz, the floor, or should I say the screen, is yours.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to your university and your center. I'm sorry I couldn't make it, but I'm very glad to be able to address you in this format, and hopefully it will go smoothly. So the talk I'm going to give today concerns some unusual features of self-consciousness in a split brain subject S. that makes such a subject unlike other pairs of self-conscious thinkers, even though, as I will argue, a split-brain human being S is indeed two self-conscious thinkers. So here's how the talk will go. First, I will obviously say something to introduce the split-brain phenomenon, and then what I call the unity puzzle of the split-brain phenomenon. And then I'm going to go part of the way towards resolving that puzzle today. So first, I'm going to present the case for thinking that there are, within a split-brain subject, two distinct thinkers of self-conscious thoughts, or I thoughts, whom I call R and L, or righty and lefty. So first, I'm going to say something about who or what righty and lefty are. And then I will defend the claim that righty and lefty are indeed distinct thinking things, and then the claim that they are distinct thinkers of self-conscious thoughts in particular. And then finally, in the third part of the talk, I will shift gears and explain why, nonetheless, despite being composed of two distinct thinkers of self-conscious thoughts, S is nonetheless not like other pairs of self-conscious thinkers. And I'll be doing this by pointing to three unusual features of self-consciousness in righty and lefty, which I call lack of mutual recognition, co-identification, and incapacity for self-distinction. So first, the split-brain phenomenon. Split-brain surgery is a colloquial term for surgery that cuts through the corpus callosum, the largest fiber tract in the human brain. And a number of these surgeries were performed in the United States, especially in the middle half of the 20th century, on adults or adolescents who, as a treatment for severe cases of epilepsy. But although the surgeries were performed for strictly medical reasons, unsurprisingly, they have some psychological consequences. After the two hemispheres are separated from each other in this way, they begin to operate independently of each other, not wholly, but to an unusual degree, in the realms of perception, cognition, and the control of action. And this independence emerges most clearly under the conditions characteristic of the split-brain experiment. Split-brain experiments exploit the fact that the two hemispheres of the human brain generally, are not totally symmetric with respect to either their receipt of sensory perceptual information from the body and world, and their control over movement or behavior. So take the case of vision. If you sit staring at a particular point on a wall, everything to the right of that point, falling in your right visual hemifield, will be received directly by your left hemisphere, and everything to the left of that point will be received directly by your right hemisphere. Of course, your two hemispheres are presumably connected by a corpus callosum, and that allows either hemisphere to gain access that only a single hemisphere initially received. But in a split-brain subject in whom the corpus callosum is missing, this information more or less stays put with some interesting results. So imagine a case, this is an experiment described by Sperry, in which a split-brain subject sits looking at a particular, keeping their eyes focused on a particular point on a screen, and that's indicated here by the plus sign. And then two different symbols, in this case, a question mark and a dollar sign, are flashed, one to the right and one to the left of this central fixation point. So here we have a question mark on the right and a dollar sign on the left. And then the screen goes blank, and you ask the subject what he saw. And typically the subject will, verbally report having seen what was on the right side of the screen, won't mention the left side of the screen. If you ask him what about the left side of the screen, will typically say that he doesn't know or that he couldn't see the left side of the screen. Why is that? Well, it's because in most people, including most split-brain subjects, the left hemisphere is the dominant hemisphere, including for spoken language. So in most split-brain subjects, the right hemisphere can't speak. So the verbal denial of having seen anything on the left is issuing from the left hemisphere. And recall that the left hemisphere receives visual information from the right visual hemifield and not from the left, which is where the dollar sign was. But if you now say, blindfold a split-brain subject or ask him to close his eyes so that he can't see what he's doing, and you give him a piece of paper and a pencil to hold in his left hand, and you ask him to draw what it was that he saw on the screen before, he will now typically draw what he saw on the left side of the screen, or what was presented on the left side of the screen, the dollar sign, right? The side in which he earlier denied having seen anything. Again, why? Because each hand is predominantly, though not exclusively, controlled by the opposite hemisphere. So this drawing is presumably issuing from the right hemisphere, which did receive information from the left side of the screens, the side on which the dollar sign was on. Now, the really interesting thing is that if you ask the subject what he just drew without allowing him to see it, without allowing him to, remove the blindfold or whatever, he will often say that he drew the question mark from the right side of the screen that he already verbally identified earlier. Now, if you remove the blindfold or let him open his eyes and look at what's on the sheet of paper and you ask him again, so tell me again, what did you draw on the sheet of paper? Now the subject sheepishly corrects himself, oh, actually I drew a dollar sign. And the subjects aren't stupid, so if you now ask the subject, at least an experienced split brain subject, so what do you think it was on the left side of the screen before? The subject will say, a dollar sign. So these sorts of results obtained under these experimental conditions suggest, in my experience, they pretty much universally evoke the kind of eerie intuition that a split brain subject's behavior is the product of two distinct conscious agencies and intelligences, as if there were two conscious minds in one body. Nonetheless, at the same time and at the end of the day, basically everyone has the overwhelming impression that a split brain subject is one of us, rather than being like two of us trapped in one body. And this is puzzling because we think, well, each of us is just one conscious thinker, right? So then the question becomes, how many of us is a split brain subject anyway? And this is what I call the unity puzzle of the split brain phenomenon. And we can give it, the classic form of a puzzle. We can identify, a triad of propositions, each of which is individually compelling, but they are mutually inconsistent. And the first proposition would be that a split brain subject has two conscious minds. And I call this, in my book, the duality intuition. And the second intuition is that a split brain subject is one person. And then the third proposition needed to make these first two in conflict, you needed to make the duality intuition and the unity intuition conflict, is that each person necessarily has exactly one conscious mind, which we could call the one mind per person rule. And my book is devoted to trying to resolve this unity puzzle, and I do so in a kind of unusual way. I actually attempt to reconcile the duality intuition, the two minds intuition, with the unity intuition, the one person intuition, by arguing that the one mind per person rule admits of at least this one exception in the split brain case. And I can't give, of course, that whole argument today, but I'm going to give a really, what I think is a very interesting and important piece of it. So what I'm going to do today is take a significant step towards resolving the unity puzzle by arguing that a split brain subject S is two thinkers, righty and lefty, right, defending the duality intuition. But I'm also going to use features of righties and lefties self-consciousness to offer a causal explanation of, if not a defense, of the impression that S is nonetheless one of us, right, rather than two. But before I do that, before I get going, I want to say something about what it means to say that a split brain subject seems like one of us. How so? What are we picking up on when a split brain subject seems like one of us rather than like two of us trapped in one body? And if you're familiar with the split brain literature at all, you might know that what people typically say about split brain subjects is that outside of the experimental conditions that strongly evoke this duality intuition, split brain subjects behave in a highly unified and basically ordinary fashion. And you would think by how often this gets said, it gets said all the time, that we knew a lot about how split brain subjects behaved outside of experimental conditions, but actually very little systematic study of split brain subjects, in their homes, walking down the street and so on was ever done. In fact, I only know of one case in which it was systematically studied. So the neuropsychologists Ferguson, Rayport, and Corey reached out to 6 split brain subjects and asked if they could follow them around for a day or two, see how they handled activities of daily living, interview family members, in one case employers, and all 6 subjects said yes. And in this case, the investigators found that all these subjects behaved in some really unusual and, disrupted and arguably disunified ways outside of experimental conditions as well. And these were behaviors that were new for them, i.e. that were, new since the surgery, right, that weren't present before the surgery. So in this case, these authors concluded that while the literature has emphasized the paucity of behavioral findings after corpus callosum section, with cerebral hemisphere competition and language problems said to be transient, leaving the patient indistinguishable from his preoperative self, we found in our cases that impairments in higher cerebral functions were evident outside the laboratory and caused considerable intrusion in the patient's everyday life. So, the one picture, we don't know enough about split brain subjects' behavior outside of experimental conditions, but certainly, the one window we have into it doesn't suggest a picture of, normalcy or unity. So the claim that they normally behave in an ordinary unified fashion has clearly been overstated. And now you might wonder, if so little study of their extra experimental behavior was ever done, why did this become the standard line? You know, philosophers repeated this, but they got it from neuropsychologists. It was neuropsychologists who said, outside the context of the experiment, you would never know. So normal, so unified. And what I think is, they didn't, you know, again, they didn't follow them home, right? Or follow them to work, or follow them to a grocery store. But what they did do, what neuropsychologists did do, is talk to split brain subjects outside of experimental contexts. I mean, there's conversation that you have when you're, you know, setting up the experiment, at the end of the experiment, during breaks sometimes, and making phone calls to arrange for, you know, the next set of experiments, and talking with them about how long it's going to take and what it's going to involve. And these were patients that these neuropsychologists worked with for decades in some cases, right? So, you know, many of these conversations were had. And what does seem to be true is that split brain subjects seem socially ordinary in a particular sense. That is, in conversing with the split brain subject, two things. First of all, you don't in any way have the sense that you were conversing with two psychological beings. Now, as I said before, you know, in most split brain subjects, speech can't issue from the right hemisphere. So even if the right hemisphere is associated with a second thinker, it's true. You are, in conversing with the split brain subject, only conversing with the single psychological being, the left hemisphere psychological being. But in addition, you also don't have the sense that you're conversing with one of only two psychological beings present. And this, I think, is the basis of the unity intuition, which I have as much as anyone else, right? When you see a split brain subject talking with someone. This, I think, is the basis of the intuition that a split brain subject seems like one of us rather than like two of us trapped in a body. And what I want to do today is account for this unity intuition consistently with the two thinkers claim in terms of features of self-consciousness in a split brain subject. Okay, so in this section, I will make the case that there are these two thinkers of self-conscious thoughts, righty and lefty, within a split brain subject. So to do this first, I have to argue that both hemisphere systems are indeed thinkers, and second, that they're the thinkers of I thoughts in particular. So taking the first question first, why not just think that the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere are merely associated with distinct conscious experiences and thoughts, or that they realize different conscious experiences and thoughts? Why posit, you know, actually distinct thinkers of those thoughts, subjects of those experiences? After all, you might wonder, could a mere hemisphere of the brain really speak? There's a kind of anthropomorphism worry that I think lurks under that question, and that has plagued, you know, a lot of attempts to defend the two thinkers claim, or the duality intuition. And I think a lot of philosophers have had this anthropomorphism worry, but it was articulated most pointedly by the philosopher Robinson when he wrote, "The plain fact is that hemispheres are not predicated of failures, confusions, contradictions, percepts, judgments. We have every right to describe post-operative Smith as feeling restored after a walk in the garden and a spinach souffle, but short of humor, we would not discuss hemispheres, minor or major, in this way." And I actually, you know, if you set aside the ordinary language philosophy, I actually, you know, take this seriously. It sounds absurd to me too, to speak of it kind of does sound like a category error, to speak of a hemisphere as feeling restored after a walk in the garden and a spinach souffle. So I take that anthropomorphism worry seriously, but I also take seriously a kind of, I don't know, anthropological fact or something that the neuropsychologist Bogan directs our attention to in his immediate reply to Robinson. He wrote, "Robinson implies that no reasonable person," he says, "we would attribute to a hemisphere such properties as a percept, memory, or a judgment. He thereby excludes from the set of reasonable persons almost all of those investigators who have had direct contact with the data." That is, I take it, almost all of those neuropsychologists who actually worked with split brain subjects. And then he goes on to say that the simplest, most straightforward way to talk about the facts is to speak of what a hemisphere can or cannot do, might do, or has just done. And then Bogan goes on to back this up with kind of like textual evidence. So he goes on to cite from the range and diversity of experimenters with really diverse, you know, ideological perspectives in psychology, many of whom were, you know, reluctant at first to attribute distinct mental states and actions to the two hemispheres, who nonetheless swiftly resorted to this way of speaking once they began working with the subjects. And, you know, it's very funny because, as he points out, some of the people he cites at the time, like they're still working within the behaviorist tradition. So they're kind of reluctant to attribute mental states to anyone. But some of them still end up saying, talking about what the right hemisphere saw or what the left hemisphere felt. And again, this is at least, at a minimum, it's a kind of, this is itself an anthropological or sociological data point that needs explaining. Why is it so hard to avoid attributing distinct mental states to the two hemispheres? Note, though, that what Robinson and Bogan are disagreeing about is the properties that can sensibly and accurately be attributed to hemispheres of the brain. And this is very characteristic of the how many minds debate about split brain subjects. So generally in this debate, only two kinds of candidate thinkers are countenanced. Either there's the split brain subject as a whole, S, the human being, and if you are defending a one thinker claim, you're arguing that it's this human being that thinks and feels and decides and so on, or the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. So that if you're defending a two thinkers claim, you're put in the position of arguing that it's the hemispheres that do these things instead. And note that this just makes the choice between a one thinker and a two thinker claim a really stark one, because hemispheres and human beings are just really different. And you might think, and in fact, I'm tempted to think that if whole human beings are ever thinkers, like in the normal case, for instance, then no mere hemisphere of the brain ever could be. But when I argue that there are two thinkers within a split brain subject, two hemisphere systems that think, or hemisphere associated systems, I don't mean to refer to the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. When I speak of righty and lefty or RNL, I'm speaking of much larger systems. And to introduce righty and lefty, I want to start by talking about another even more radical kind of surgical procedure known as hemispherectomy. Here we see MRI images of two patients who have undergone this procedure, and we're seeing both of them from the back. You can see the cerebellum at the bottom. So hemispherectomy, as you can tell from these pictures, is the removal or functional incapacitation of an entire cerebral hemisphere. So the person on the left has undergone right hemispherectomy, and the person on the right has undergone left hemispherectomy. And hemispherectomy is a very radical procedure. You do not want to have it done if you can avoid it, especially dominant hemispherectomy, that is removal of your especially language dominant hemisphere, which again for most people would be the left hemisphere. And you especially don't want this done in adulthood following normal development. Nonetheless, there have been cases of hemispherectomy performed on adults following normal development, right or left, dominant or non-dominant. And studying those cases makes clear that all these human beings still have a conscious mind. Those who have lost their language dominant hemisphere, obviously their capacity for spoken language is really devastated, though they do start to regain some capacity for speech kind of surprisingly quickly. But they are, they seem to have normal kind of like moods, wake sleep cycles, arousal levels, personality doesn't appear, it's reported that their personality appears to be the same insofar as one can judge without language. They make choices. They make socially appropriate choices. They appear to exhibit self-conscious emotions like embarrassment in contexts in which it would make sense to feel such a thing. So in other words, what hemispherectomy shows us is that an entire human being minus a single hemisphere, right or left, is still a thinker. And it can thus be used to pick out two strong candidate thinkers in the split brain case, stronger candidates than mere hemispheres. So first take an entire split brain human being and then exclude his right hemisphere and all of its contributions to his psychobehavioral functions. Right? And the remainder, which is almost an entire human being, is the being that I'm calling lefty or L. And note that in terms of lefty's intrinsic structure and capacities, lefty is equivalent to a human being who has undergone right hemispherectomy. And now take that same split brain human being, the entire animal, and only exclude his left hemisphere and its contributions to his psychobehavioral functioning. And the remainder is what I'm calling righty or R, and righty is intrinsically equivalent to a human being who has undergone left hemispherectomy. And righty and lefty both exist in the split brain case, right? And they overlap substantially. You know, even more substantially than I've shown here, since for simplification, I've shown each of them as having one hand in its entirety and exclusively. The real situation is more complicated than that, but that would have been a lot harder to draw. So they do overlap substantially, but not entirely. And the major point of non-overlap is a very psychologically significant one. Each has an entire cerebral hemisphere that the other lacks. Hemispherectomy means that our question isn't whether things with righties and lefties' intrinsic properties can be thinkers. We might have that question about mere hemispheres. But thanks to hemispherectomy, we know that things with righties and lefties' intrinsic properties can be thinkers. Our question then becomes whether, when righty and lefty are both functioning and present, as they are within a split brain subject, they are distinct thinkers. So that's to say that I don't think that hemispherectomy can be used to show that the two thinkers claim is true. After all, you and I each contain a righty and a lefty as well, and we don't think that we're two thinkers apiece. But you and I also each contain a corpus callosum that, you know, subserves psychological interaction between righty cerebral hemisphere and lefty cerebral hemisphere, right? And that's not true in a split brain subject. So our question becomes, when both hemispheres are present and functioning, do they inevitably interact so as to realize a single mind, or only when the corpus callosum is also present? So to answer this question, we need to know what it is to be a thinker, and we need to know the kind of integration that typifies the workings of a single mind. And there's actually been surprisingly few philosophers have spoken about this. You know, there have been a lot of philosophers have addressed themselves to the question of what capacities a being needs to have in order to be a thinker. You know, does a thinker need to have the capacity for belief, for instance, or is perception enough, right? Or does a thinker need to have the capacity for consciousness, or could you have a non-conscious mind, and so on? But what philosophers haven't typically addressed themselves to is the question of what it is to have those capacities in the first place, because that's what the split brain debate is about, right? Everyone recognizes that both hemispheres have the relevant capacities in some sense, but do they have the capacities in the way that I have the capacity for belief and judgment forming and decision making, or do they merely, you know, again, realize or subserve those capacities, right? So ours is a different kind of subtler question. But while only a few philosophers have addressed these questions, Shoemaker has, right? And he has shown that actually these questions and their answers are deeply related. So I'm going to be borrowing liberally here from Shoemaker's account of what I call the thinking relation. That is, you know, the relation that a thinker, as opposed to a mere realizer of a thought, stands into that thought. So in Shoemaker's account, here I think are the major and essential elements. First, a thinker is a specific kind of causal system. What kind? Well, the kind within which specific kinds of activities take place. Judgment making, goal forming, perceiving, attending, and so on. Now, each of these kinds of activity is itself causally defined, and causally defined largely in terms of the way it interacts with other psychological activities. Okay, so here's a statement that you should be familiar just from presentations of functionalism, that it is in the nature of mental activities to interact with other mental activities in particular ways. So for instance, it's in the nature of percepts to give rise to desires, and it's in the nature of desires to be caused by percepts, but not to cause them. So for instance, seeing cupcakes makes me want a cupcake, but hopefully wanting a cupcake doesn't make me see one in front of me. Or to use the more familiar philosophical example, beliefs and desires are the mental states that interact to form or to produce the intentions to perform actions that would be sufficient to satisfy those desires were those beliefs true. So again, the very classic philosophical example, believing that it is raining interacts with wanting to stay dry to produce the intention to take an umbrella. Okay, so again, this should be familiar from any presentation of functionalism, but what Shoemaker points out is that when we say this, that it's in the nature of mental activities to interact with other mental activities in particular ways, we mean only other mental activities of the same thinker. This point is so obvious that it often goes unstated. And so you'll often read something that is written like the first bullet point and doesn't bother including the second, right? Or you'll read, as I said before, you'll read something that says something like, believing that it is raining interacts with wanting to stay dry to produce taking an umbrella or an intention to take the umbrella. But of course, what we mean is my wanting to stay dry interacts with my believing it's raining to dispose me to take an umbrella, or your believing it's raining interacts with your desire to stay dry to, you know, lead you to form the intention to take an umbrella. Obviously, if you believe that it's raining, but you don't care if you get a little wet, and I don't want to get wet, but I believe it's brilliantly sunny outside, then no one will form the intention to take an umbrella. So it's in the nature of mental activities to interact with other mental activities of the same thinker in particular ways. And righties' mental activities interact with righties in those ways. Lefties' mental activities interact with lefties in those ways. But for the most part, I'm simplifying here, of course, but for the most part, righties' mental activities do not interact with lefties in those ways. And this is what makes righty and lefty distinct thinkers. That is the fact that a thinker is a causal system within which mental activities operate. These activities are themselves causally defined. And within a split brain subject, the causal systems within which mental activities interact and operate in these ways are more nearly righty and lefty than S, the split brain subject as a whole. So, you know, consider the question mark $ experiment again. You know, again, the $ is presented on the left side of the screen. And you might say, well, yeah, sure, initially the subject can't say what was on the left side of the screen. But, you know, like a little extra help, he first, you know, draws it on a sheet of paper. And, you know, ultimately, by seeing the drawing, does form the belief that there was a $ on the left side of the screen, right? Like in just like the way in which if you presented a $ on the screen for me, right, I would perceive it and then form the belief that it was a $ on the left side of the screen, right? Except obviously not in the same way, right, whatsoever, because here, the interaction between the right hemisphere percept of the $, which we must posit existed in order to explain the drawing behavior, and the ultimate left hemisphere belief that it was a $ on the left side of the screen, which we must posit to account for the subject's ultimate verbal statement that it was a $ on the left side of the screen. This interaction involved, you know, the production of a drawing, right, on a sheet of paper, which the left hemisphere then had to see. So in other words, if you look at the overall causal sequence of events, right, you do have percepts causing beliefs, as beliefs are wont to do, and as percepts are wont to do, and beliefs interacting with desires not shown, causing intentions, as beliefs are wont to do, but only within one hemisphere system or the other. And again, you might say, how so? Because you might say, you know, look, this left hemisphere belief, you know, that ultimately forms that it was a $, on the left side of the screen. I mean, that's ultimately the causal product of the right hemisphere visual experience, right? Like if that right hemisphere visual percept hadn't formed, then obviously that left hemisphere belief wouldn't have formed either in this particular case. But actually we see that, no, I mean, what's required for the left hemisphere belief is a left hemisphere percept, right? All that the right hemisphere percept is sufficient for is the production of a right hemisphere belief. So again, we see percepts causing beliefs, right, in like a characteristic way, but only within each of the hemisphere systems. In other words, a different way of putting it is to say, the right hemisphere percept of the $ only acts like a percept, at least only acts like a conscious percept, relative to other states of the right hemisphere, and not relative to states and behaviors of the left hemisphere, and so on for other right hemisphere and left hemisphere mental states. And note that this is why it's so difficult to even describe a lot of the split brain behavior in familiar psychological terms without resorting to speaking about what one hemisphere saw or what the other hemisphere did. And this explains Bogan's observation, that even people were loath to do so, nonetheless did so eventually. That is, you know, again, taking the question mark $ case, you can't simply say, oh yeah, well, the subject saw the $ on the left, given the subject's verbal denial of having seen anything on the left, together with the generalization about the causal role of seeing, right? That if you've seen something, again, at least consciously seen something, you can, you know, you believe that you saw it and you can report having seen it when asked. Now, obviously, you know, we're not limited to, even if we, you know, want to describe the split brain results in familiar psychological terms, we're not limited to just saying S saw the $ on the left or S didn't see the $ on the left, right? We can say something like, well, the subject saw it, but he only saw it with or in or via his right hemisphere, whereas, you know, via his left hemisphere, he didn't see it, and via his left hemisphere, he denied having seen anything. And I think that's fine. But this statement implicitly acknowledges that it's within the boundaries of each hemisphere system that psychological activities are operating, right? That you can't, that things like seeing and denying are happening within the boundaries of each of these systems rather than, again, in some, broadly within the subject as a whole. And I finally want to note, none of this to deny that righties' mental states interact with lefties. They do interact all the time. Actually, the question mark $ experiment presents an example of interhemispheric interaction. It is ultimately the right hemisphere, percept of the $, which eventually gives rise to the left hemisphere belief that it was a $, on the left side of the screen, right? So they definitely do interact. But then again, my mental states interact with yours too right now. And that interaction is similarly indirect, right? For the most part, right? The claim is that for the most part, at least, righties' mental states interact with lefties, not in the way that only mental states of a single mind can, but rather in the way that multiple thinkers' mental states can interact. That is via the mediation of action and perception. The real way they interact in the case of the question mark $ experiment is, I said it's not like what would happen if you showed me something on the screen and and I formed a belief that it was whatever it was on that basis. It's rather more like if I knew that you had been shown something on a screen and then I saw you in response to the question, please draw what you saw on the screen a moment ago. I saw you draw a $. I too would infer that it had in fact been a $. On the left side of the screen. Okay, so in conclusion, activities of perceiving, judgment forming, remembering, and so on operate within the boundaries of each hemisphere system, at least more so than within those of the human being as a whole. Right hemisphere psychic activities do still interact with left hemisphere psychic activities, but mostly only via the mediation of action and perception. That is, one of them does something and the other perceives it. And that's how my mind interacts with yours. So this is the basis of my affirmative answer to this first question. Are both hemisphere systems truly thinkers? Yes, they are. Now, are both hemisphere systems truly the thinkers of I thoughts? As I said, mostly in the split brain debates, people haven't doubted that the right hemisphere is associated somehow with, normal psychological capacities that are necessary for something to have a mind and even to be a person. But self-consciousness is an exception. Generally, philosophers and neuropsychologists who have addressed themselves to the topic of self-consciousness at all have doubted that the right hemisphere is a site or source of self-consciousness. No one doubts that the left hemisphere is the source of I thoughts because via their left hemisphere, split brain subjects make I statements, right? They say things like, I'm tired, or I don't know what was on the left, right? But it's poor silent righty whose status as a self-conscious creature is doubted. But I think that there's I think that the split brain literature shows pretty clearly that the right hemisphere too is associated with I thoughts. So if it's a thinker of thoughts, then it is an I thinker. And I'll just talk about a single experiment. So this was, that I think shows this pretty clearly. So this is an experiment, 2 split brain subjects, and each of them was seated at a table with 5 pegs in front of his hands that were horizontally oriented. And there's 5 pegs before each hand. And the subjects were trained to tap these pegs to use them as something like the equivalent of a multiple choice scantron. So tapping the rightmost peg to signify extremely and the leftmost peg to signify not at all. And then the setup was a little different for the 2 subjects, but regardless, both of them were asked a bunch of questions about their, testing their self-image, their preferences, their values, and their mental and emotional lives. For instance, the first subject, it turned out that he had been bullied really throughout his childhood. And so he was asked a bunch of questions about, his experiences of being bullied at the time and his thoughts about and feelings towards the bullying and the bullies now. And the second question was, the second subject was asked a bunch of questions like, how much do you feel lonely? How much do you feel respected? How much do you feel sad? How much do you feel loved? And so on. And the subjects were responding in each case with both hands simultaneously. And in some cases, different questions were presented simultaneously to the two hemispheres also, so that they were answering different questions. And the results of this study are, I would summarize them by saying, some of the questions were more sensitive questions than others. And for the less sensitive questions, the hands, largely gave the same responses. For the more sensitive questions, the hands gave, I would say not wildly different, but significantly different responses, right? Of the sort that, you might see my sister and I give similarly, similar yet significantly different responses to similar kinds of questions. And yet each hand's responses were internally consistent. So the fact that each hand's responses were internally consistent, presenting, a picture of a, coherent psychological profile, suggests that, the actions of each hand really were the actions of an agent, right? That someone was understanding the question and giving sensible answers to those questions based on their understanding. On the other hand, the fact that the responses of the two hands were inconsistent, and again, in some cases, the hands were responding simultaneously to two different questions anyway, suggests that the comprehending agent of the left hand responses was not the same agent as the comprehending agent of the right hand responses. So left hand responses, there's reason to believe here, I think pretty clearly, were the behavior, were being guided by right hemisphere thought and understanding. And these are, again, questions like, how much do you feel lonely? Imagine if you could, if you got what you thought was, really a sensible answer to that question from a chimpanzee, right? This would make them persons. So I think this shows pretty clearly that yes, both hemisphere systems are truly the thinkers of I thoughts in particular. But shifting gears, I now want to argue that there's something about the dynamics of self-conscious thoughts after split brain surgery. That is something about the kinds of self-conscious thoughts righty and lefty think and the context in which they think them that makes them unlike other pairs of self-conscious thinkers. And, I think this is what people are getting at when they say things like, well, a split brain subject doesn't feel as though she were multiple persons. And the problem with statements like this in the context of personal identity is that, in the context of personal identity debates about the split brain phenomenon, these sorts of statements are really ambiguous. Do they mean that S, the split brain subject, doesn't feel as though S were multiple persons? Do they mean that lefty doesn't feel as though S were multiple persons? Do they mean that lefty doesn't feel as though lefty were multiple persons? Because obviously the last possibility is totally consistent with the two persons claim. But nonetheless, despite the, despite the ambiguity of these statements, I do think that they're getting at something true and important. And here's, I think, the first thing they're getting at. It does appear to be the case that neither righty nor lefty recognizes the other's existence. And again, I think the split brain literature as a whole clearly shows this, but I'll talk about a particular kind of funny experiment that I think shows it clearly. So in this experiment, this was with the split brain subject JW. JW was taught to play a game that was something like a cross between Potter and Colder and 20 questions. So in the first round of the experiment, the experimenter says he's thinking of a number between 0 and 9. JW vocally guesses, that is presumably lefty guesses, what the number is. And then the experimenter provides feedback by pointing to a card on which are written the options go up, go down, or okay. So let's say, JW guesses that the number is 7 and the number the experimenter is thinking of is 6. The experimenter taps go down. JW guesses 6. The experimenter taps okay. Second round of the experiment, they switch roles. So one experimenter presents JW a number between 0 and 9. The second experimenter tries to guess what the number is vocally. And JW uses the left hand, that is, presumably, though not necessarily righty's hand in this case, to point to this card on which are written the options go up, go down, or okay. And then in the third crucial round of the experiment, JW takes on both roles at once. So a number between 0 and 9 is presented only to JW's right hemisphere, only to righty. JW vocally guesses, that is lefty guesses what the number is, and then uses the left hand, that is righty, presumably uses the left hand to provide feedback by pointing to this card on which are written the options go up, go down, or okay. And JW could do this. He could play this game with himself. He apparently found it, moderately amusing compared to a lot of split brain experiments, which are sort of boring. And note You know, on the one hand, this is the sort of result that intuitively, you know, it provides one piece of evidence for a two thinkers claim. I couldn't play this game by myself because my knowing the correct answer would preclude my genuinely guessing. But in JW can actually play this game with himself because there are two players, right? There is a knower and a guesser, and the knower, you know, is distinct from the guesser and therefore can provide help to the guesser. You know, it's actually funny because this is the one paper I know of, I think, in which the experimenters really did, they refused to attribute distinct mental states or actions to the two hemispheres. But what they ended up saying instead is they would say things like, well, JW's mouth guessed 7, but his left hand suggested that the answer was lower, right? Like, which is hardly better than, you know, saying that mouths guess is hardly better than saying that hemispheres guess. I mean, it seems worse. We know that mouths can't guess. But again, it just demonstrates like how difficult it is to even describe the results without somehow relativizing, right, your psychological attributions to something. Nonetheless, you know, I say like this provides some evidence for the two thinkers claim, but this is apparently not how JW thought about it. And I say this because the experimenters comment that in this third crucial round of the experiment, JW had to be repeatedly reminded, that is presumably lefty had to be repeatedly reminded to direct the guesses to the left hand. That is, lefty kept looking at the experimenter and saying, is it a 7? And the experimenter would have to say, I don't know, why don't you ask your left hand? And then lefty would go, oh, right, is it a 7? And lo, the left hand would provide the answer. Why did JW or lefty have to be repeatedly reminded to do this? Well, presumably because that's just not how we think about our hands. I always joke, like, you know, if I want to make a sandwich, I don't say, hey, are you guys doing anything? Right? And that appears to be the way lefties think about the left hand, not as a, you know, not as a being who knows something that he doesn't, right? Or as the hand of a being who knows something that he doesn't, but just as like a hand. All right, so I think this shows like pretty conclusively, and again, I think the split brain literature as a whole supports this, that lefty doesn't recognize righty as a separate psychological being. It's always a little harder to tell with righty given the lack of I statements, but I think from what we can tell, it looks as though righty doesn't recognize lefty as a separate psychological being either. And, you know, if you know anything about the split brain literature, you might say, wait a sec, aren't there cases in which lefty appears to recognize the existence of a separate left-hand agent? So, you know, we have these anecdotal reports. Bogan writes, one patient told me he was pretty good because he'd gone to the ball game with his wife, and this was something he hadn't done in years because of the seizures he'd been having so often. But then he said, well, what was unusual was she bought some licorice, which I don't like, and we had the shopping bag between us on the way home, and my left hand reached in the bag and pulled out the licorice, which I don't like. I said, what happened? He said, the left hand brought it up to my mouth, so I ate it, but I didn't like it. Now this is, again, by hypothesis, lefty speaking here, but seems to be attributing some separate action to the left hand, right? I ate it because the left hand brought it to my mouth, not I ate it because I had brought it to my mouth, right? Or, you know, maybe more dramatically in the same paper, Bogan says, when one of my patients first told me about intermanual conflict, I didn't tell anyone because I didn't think they would believe it. He and his wife came to the office and I said, how are things? He said, all right, except I'm having a little bit of trouble with my left hand. I said, how's that? He said, well, I picked up the paper to read it and my left hand took the paper away and set it down. So I picked it up again and my left hand came up and set it down again. So I picked it up and this time the left hand came up and picked up the paper and threw it on the floor. And, you know, again, this seems to be a case of separate agency being attributed to the left hand. I've read several anecdotal reports of this, by the way, that split brain subjects complaining that ever since the surgery, their left hand won't let them read anymore. And, you know, a number of them stop reading. Some of them resort to a different strategy that this patient more pointedly describes. My right hand's good, my left hand, I have to fight with it. If I'm reading, I can hold a book in my right hand, and it's a lot easier to sit on my left hand than to hold it with both hands than fighting it. I compensate for everything that's wrong or feels wrong. One hand that fights you, I can't use it a lot. If I had to lose an arm, I'd rather lose my left arm than my right one. The right one knows what I want it to do, and it doesn't. With your right hand, you correct what the left has done. Again, seemingly demonstrated some kind of recognition on lefty's part of separate left-hand agency. And I think this is true. There are many cases in which lefty speaks as if the left hand were a somewhat autonomous agent of some kind. But still, even when lefty says things like, oh, you know, it's always trying to put the paper down, the it appears to refer to the left hand rather than to another thinker to whom the left hand also belongs. So the claim here is that neither recognizes a second thinking thing. And in fact, you know, in the quotes that I just provided, actions are attributed to the left hand, but never, you know, desires or, you know, intentions that can be read like apart from the actions themselves, right? Or think about the, you know, the subject I quoted last who said, well, you know, if I'm reading, it's easier just to sit on my left hand, right? Rather than deal with the conflict from it. Well, that is not how well-socialized adults handle interpersonal conflict, right? By sitting on each other. But that's not how Lefty's thinking about it. Lefty's not thinking of it as interpersonal conflict. Lefty's not thinking that there's someone else here who wants to do something else, like maybe watch TV. Lefty's just thinking, what the heck is wrong with my left hand, right? That it's just a part of its body and no one else's. Right? So again, this is the first claim, that neither of them recognizes the existence of a second thinker sharing its body. Second, instead of recognizing that they share one body, they both seem to identify themselves as S. So I call this claim co-identification. The righty and lefty both assume that S is one thinker and each takes itself to be that thinker. That is, each assumes, I'm that thinker. I'm the only one home. Now, it's true, as we've seen in some of these examples already, that lefty clearly identifies more strongly with its actions than with righties, at least in some cases. I don't think it's always true. But there, you know, at least we don't always have evidence for it. But there are clearly lots of cases in which lefty expresses a certain kind of alienation from left-hand actions of righty, right? Much more frequently than lefty expresses such alienation from right-hand actions. Again, since righty doesn't make I statements, the data is more ambiguous, but presumably this too is mutual. So it's not uncommon for lefty to say of righty's responses, oh, I didn't mean to do that, or I don't know why I did that, or I must have done it unconsciously, right? Much more often than lefty does of righty's responses. So, you know, consider this subject talking about what she experiences. I open the closet door, I know what I want to wear. As I reach for something with my right hand, my left hand comes up and takes something different. I can't put it down if it's in my right hand. I have to call my daughter. Again, by hypothesis, this is lefty speaking. Lefty says, I reach with my right hand. The right hand being treated as just a mere vehicle of lefty's agency. Then my left hand does something different. Not I do something different with my left hand. My left hand does something different. Right, so, you know, I think again, lefty does identify more strongly with its own actions than with righties, but I want to say that they at least weakly identify with each other. That is, each assumes that it is the person who is most responsible for the actions of either hand. So, you know, actually the same subject in a different context says, I get so disgusted with myself. I know what I want to do, but the hand won't cooperate with the mind. Again, it's the hand that won't cooperate, right? So there's a kind of agency being attributed here to the left hand, but it's, I get so disgusted with myself, not like with that, you know, stubborn jerk, right? With whom I share this hand. Now, I say they weakly identify with each other, but I also said they don't know about each other's existence. They weakly identify with each other indirectly, by each self-identifying as S. And that means that anything either of them does, the other will think, well, I did that even if I didn't do that deliberately. Okay, so again, this is the co-identification claim, that they both assume that S is one thinker and they both take themselves to be that thinker. Third unusual feature of self-consciousness in righty and lefty. And this one is a little more speculative because it's meant to offer an explanation for, and it is an inference from the previous two features. I think that what explains lack of recognition and co-identification in a split brain subject is that righty and lefty can't distinguish themselves from each other. Right, so I call this incapacity for self-distinction. It's a capacity that each lacks with respect to the other. That even if righty and lefty intellectually knew that there were two of them there, neither would be able to tell on a moment-to-moment basis who had done what, at least not on ordinary first-personal grounds. And I say this partly because of the split brain subject LB, who was very intelligent and began reading the split brain literature for fun, which you always wonder whether these like cognitive neuropsychology patients do, right? Well, LB did. He read some of the split brain literature for fun, and he became quite fluent in it. The neuropsychologist Bogan, I mentioned before, once quipped that LB seemed to have a better grasp of the split brain literature than did a lot of the experimenters who were testing him. So he reached a point at which he could say things like, you know, when you asked him about his performance on a test, he or Lefty could say things like, I cannot name objects in the left visual field because the information is conveyed to my right hemisphere, which has no language centers. And because of surgery, that information cannot reach my left hemisphere, right? So clearly very fluent in the split brain literature. And yet the same authors, you know, comment immediately afterwards that one has a very strong impression that his intellectual understanding is completely separate from his ordinary self-consciousness. What do they mean? Well, you know, take a case in which, you know, you've had a block of trials. Lefty has said, well, I don't know how I'm going to do this. I can't see anything on the left. And you say, just try. Use your left hand to just, you know, do your best. And then you confront him afterwards and you say, you said you couldn't see anything, but you scored 95% accurately. How do you explain that? And LB says something like he says here in the first quote, right? And this is his intellectual understanding. He steps back and reflects on himself, given what he knows about the split brain literature, and he says this. On the other hand, moment to moment, trial to trial basis, left hand does something and Lefty says, whoops, I didn't mean to do that, right? It's as though it's never available to Lefty that like, oh, that's not something I did accidentally. That's something like the other hemisphere did deliberately. And that's despite the fact that if LB read enough of the split brain literature to be as fluent in it as he apparently was, I mean, first of all, there's literally zero doubt that he read neuropsychologists, you know, attributing, you know, saying things like, well, the right hemisphere chose this, but the left hemisphere saw that, and so on, right? He definitely read that. And he quite probably read people saying about his left hemisphere that the left hemisphere throughout this exhibited no awareness of the right hemispheres, like, you know, experiences or contributions or of the right hemisphere's existence, right? So this suggests to me that, you know, it's not just an intellectual problem, right? Like, oh, if only they'd read the split brain papers. He did. It suggests to me that there is, you know, a pre-theoretic obstacle to mutual recognition in the split brain cases, right? An actual capacity that they lack, which I think, again, is this capacity for distinguishing themselves from the other on a moment-to-moment basis, knowing that it was, you know, me versus the other hemisphere guy that did that. And now, strictly speaking, note that no one distinguishes herself from others on wholly first personal grounds, because we can't introspect other beings' mental states. And the personal perceptual modalities, that is, you know, unlike audition and vision, the ones that function to tell us about our own body specifically, like proprioception or pain perception, they aren't sources of information about other people's bodies. Rather, in the normal case, it's the impersonal perceptual modalities like audition and vision. They provide us information about all these bodies, right, including our own. And then there's one body about which we have this further source of information, right, from these personal perceptual modalities. And it's the non-overlap there, right, between all the bodies we know about in this other way and this one body we know about in this way, that I think provides the basis, the ordinary basis for distinguishing oneself from others. And the problem, of course, in the split brain case is that righty and lefty each have first personal knowledge of and control over not only, right, its own, but also the other's body. Now, this is not true for introspection. Each should be able to introspect only its own mental states, right, and not those of the other. So if human thinkers had perfect introspective self-knowledge, and if we had perfect self-control, then presumably righty and lefty would be able to confidently distinguish their actions from the others, because, you know, in that case, you know, let's say righty would do something with the left hand and lefty would just think, well, I know that I didn't, I know that I didn't intend to do that. Therefore, I must not have done it. Someone else must have done it. But obviously, you know, we don't have that kind of perfect self-knowledge or self-control. We do things unintentionally, right? Or without being conscious of a moment before what we were planning on doing. And so they can't use the fact that introspection is still private as a basis for distinguishing you know, each's actions from the other. And because of this, because they can't distinguish themselves from each other on ordinary first personal grounds, they can't interact with each other as distinct social beings, right? Rather, either thing, that requires me to be able to distinguish between something I did and something my conversation partner or my competitor did. Instead, anything either of them does, both are forced to think I did that, right? So they can't interact with each other as distinct social beings, nor can they interact with other parties independently in the social realm. And this, I think, is the explanation for the off-sided social normalcy of split brain subjects, right? That if whenever righty does something and you ask the subject, so why did you do that? Lefty never says, well, which one of us are you talking to? Or you better not be talking to me, ask him. Or who knows why he does anything, right? Instead, lefty answers in an I statement, right? About why I did such a thing, right? I think that if that were not true, if lefty did start saying things like, which one of us are you talking to, or ask him, our intuitions would rapidly shift, right? We would have the impression that we were speaking to one of only two psychological beings present, right? But instead, lefty uses I statements to refer to anything either of them did, right? So that is to say that even if they're most disunified, righty and lefty still act as though S were a single social subject. And if I'm right, they have no other option. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One of the downsides of webinar is that we can't really clap, but I'm sure the heart is there. So let me remind the attendees of how we're going to be proceeding. Click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and put your name, and I will move you from attendee to panelist. It takes a few seconds to transition, so don't be surprised if it takes a few seconds. All right.
Down at this point.
David, you're the first. You're the first one.
Thank you. Am I visible?
Yes, you are. Yes.
Sorry. Excuse the baby. Consequences of COVID. Well, it's a sort of quite sort of simple, almost naive question about the last little bit of the talk. So, what's wrong with interpreting? What was his name? Just LB?
Yeah.
Or something in that position, just as being mundanely wrong in the judgment that that he's that there aren't two separate speakers present. I mean, you're advancing, as far as I can tell, as an amateur, a pretty plausible case that we should think that that L and R are separate, but it's not an uncontested case. Somebody could push back against it, and as you say, we realistically don't have completely preferred introspective access to these things. I mean, I can perfectly well notice I'm picking up and eating Doritos without intending it, and suddenly come to realise it or something. So, I mean, do we have the option just to say, okay, fine, LB's formed a judgment about whether he's actually a unique person or whether there's another? Well, obviously we respect his judgment substantially because there's a lot of data, but he doesn't have preferred introspective access to it, and we're just going to hold on to the line that says actually he's wrong.
Yeah. You mean, in other words, that, he has made a mistake, but it is a kind of intellectual mistake. It's not that he's incapable. It's not that lefty would be incapable of telling who had done what.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I suppose the next step of the logic would be give him, suppose you give him your book to read, and can he come back to the book and say, actually, you know what, this is pretty persuasive. It still doesn't seem to me internally as if there's two of me, but I guess I must have been mistaken about that.
Yeah, so I think yes and no. So, I mean, I think it would certainly be possible, part of what I was arguing was it should be possible for lefty to, form that belief. It should still be very difficult to tell on a moment-to-moment basis who has done what. Now, of course, we can shift into intellectual understanding pretty quickly, right? So I'm sure he could, presumably lefty could train himself to, he might still automatically say, oh, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. But, maybe, especially if he had some help initially from neuropsychologists, he could then immediately have the thought, oh, maybe I didn't do that. Maybe righty did that. Right? Again, that would not be, self-distinction on ordinary first personal grounds, right? Because it wouldn't be using the kind of process that I think is normally involved. I do think that, you know, I mean, there's certain kinds of theoretical considerations that I think lend support to this also. So, you know, people have pointed out that, you know, it's kind of like, you know, Dennett's paper, Where Am I, where his brain is attached via via radio links to, you know, a body, and his brain is actually, you know, very distant from the body and so on. You know, and you could, if you have that at that experiment, why not just say two brains hooked up to the very same body, right? And how long would it take one of them to come to the conclusion, and on what basis would it come to the conclusion that there was someone else there, rather than just thinking, oh, so, you know, my control over this body is really imperfect, right? It often doesn't do, right, what I needed to do. I mean, it does seem as in that quote, I mean, the funny thing is, experimenters were always making these claims about split brain subjects that they weren't making about themselves. I mean, again, it's the experimenters who say, oh, the right hemisphere saw this, but the left hemisphere said that, and so on. And, you know, the subjects aren't doing this. And again, the experimenters find it like impossible to avoid speaking this way. Now, again, you might think, oh, that's because that, you know, the subjects, right, they don't know what the experimenters know. But in a sense, in this, at least in the case of this subject, he did know everything the experimenters know. But his position, of course, is different from theirs, right? Because it's, you know, it's actually him, right? As opposed to some third party he's looking at. So I guess I think that, I mean, partly I guess I think that it would have at least been, it's surprising to me that he wouldn't have resorted to some of the same ways of talking that other experimenters did if the obstacle were purely intellectual. Again, if I'm right about the ordinary basis of self-distinction, then I think we could also just simply predict that they, you know, that the basis would not be there in subjects, again, because of the extent to which righty and lefty are co-embodied in this case. But, you know, all that said, I do want to say, no one tried to get righty and lefty to recognize each other's existence. You know, and there might have been, you know, maybe it would have been possible, right, if they had developed certain kind of practices and habits. So I don't want to necessarily claim that it's an ultimate incapacity. Maybe it's a capacity that could be developed the same way that we think many capacities develop in babies, right? Yeah, partly with a certain amount of help. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. Brian, good to see you.
Good to see you too. First of all, thanks for the talk, and also thanks for the book, because it was something that I think we needed in the literature. So
thank you so much.
Great you wrote it. And my question is about the two different populations of split brain patients. I mean, we have the population of the results of surgery, but then there's the second population of the agenesis of corpus callosum, and you talk about it briefly in your book.
Yeah.
But am I right in thinking that most of the cases that you talk about are from the surgeries as versus from agenesis? And in particular, I'm thinking of the comparison you drew to hemispherectomies, that people who've had hemispherectomies as infants may not even be recognized by others as having any problem at all or any difference, whereas adults are severely impaired.
Right.
So can you talk about those two different populations and how it relates to your arguments?
I mean, there's actually a couple other populations I talk about too. I mean, I make certain comparisons to certain cases of conjoined twins, but I also talk about there are cases of people suffering organic callosal damage. It's kind of unusual, but it can't, I guess just because of the vasculature of the brain, but it can happen that someone suffers a lesion that primarily just affects the corpus callosum, and you know, those are non-surgical cases, so it won't be the entire corpus callosum damage, but there's some really interesting research that comes out of that too. And then of course, most split brain experiments have been with non-human animals, and you get some really converging results from those experiments as well. But yes, agenesis of the corpus callosum, I mean, at first they kind of, I mean, in that case, I would need to look up the details of this, but there's some tract that they is present, some white matter tract that is present in people with agenesis of the corpus callosum that they think actually takes on, I mean, now I think the most recent thought is that it actually kind of is the corpus callosum, but a very unusually located corpus callosum. But they do think that in any event, it takes on a lot of the functions of the corpus callosum. But yeah, you see this with, I mean, there are some complications here from my picture because, you know, you see also in people who underwent split brain surgery at a very young age, you don't necessarily see it the same way with people undergoing a hemispherectomy to some age. At the young age, you don't see the same dramatic results with them. And what's problematic about this for my picture is that you might think, oh, okay, well, they just develop, you know, again, maybe some other white matter tract ends up taking on more and more of a role. And, you know, I think that's plausible. But it also must be said that the corpus callosum doesn't finish myelinating until a pretty advanced age, until about, you know, around age 10. So I've never seen any studies on this, but there's a question about whether you would get certain kinds of split brain results, like just with neurotypical children, just because the corpus callosum hasn't fully developed yet at that point. Right, and that would be, I mean, I think a lot of people would take that, even I would take that to be a prima facie challenge, right? If it turns out that neurotypical children are a little more like split brain adults, right? Closer to the two thinkers end of the spectrum than neurotypical human adults are. But yes, with people who've undergone agenesis of the corpus callosum, you do see certain kinds of dissociations, but they, you know, the standard line is that they are more often in the realm of implicit processing, as opposed to, you know, more conscious personal level psychological processing.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. Siddharth, the floor is yours.
Thanks. So my question is about to what extent can we attribute consciousness of being thinkers to righty and lefty? So you have argued very persuasively, at least to me, that there are two thinkers, and moreover, that these thinkers are quote unquote aware that they're thinkers. Yeah. But is this a kind of conscious awareness, right? So I can imagine sort of a robot program to have a kind of self-model. So in a way, it's aware that it is a being in the world that has a kind of boundary and acts upon the world. But perhaps we don't want to attribute a kind of phenomenal consciousness to that robot. So do you think any of these experiments tell us whether there are sort of two centers of phenomenal consciousness, or we just don't know?
I mean, it's so yes and no. So yes, if you think that we can judge, you know, yes, if you think that, like, to the extent that you think that behavioral evidence can reveal phenomenal consciousness generally. So, you know, I think there's very good reason to think that there are access conscious mental states in the right hemisphere, and that access consciousness is at least substantively divided between the two hemispheres. So again, think of the question mark $ experiment. You know, yes, there is such a thing as unconscious perception, but typically, you know, it doesn't extend to asking someone, you know, 30 seconds or 60 seconds later, would you please draw a picture of what you saw on the screen before, right? And then getting that intentional communicative act, right, of drawing, right, what they saw. So that looks like a case of conscious processing that is and conscious experience that is distinct from the conscious experience in the left hemisphere. But again, that's access consciousness, right, which is sort of clearly functionally or causally defined. And that has meant that some, you know, interestingly, I don't know of anyone who's denied phenomenal consciousness to the right hemisphere, but some people, both neuropsychologists and philosophers, have suggested that maybe phenomenal consciousness is bihemispheric but unified after split brain surgery, and that the kinds of behavioral dissociations we see reflect, you know, a breakdown in access unity, right? Unity of access consciousness, but perhaps there still remains some kind of unified phenomenal perspective or phenomenal field. And it's, you know, I mean, it's just a problem I face as well as many other people. Like once you start, divorcing phenomenal consciousness and evidence for phenomenal consciousness from access consciousness and evidence for access consciousness, it gets kind of hard to judge. I mean, I think it's in some ways it's an intuitively appealing idea because, again, the impression when you see a split brain subject talking to someone, the impression that there's one person there is overwhelmingly powerful. I mean, I have it as much as anyone else does. And so it becomes really tempting to think, oh, there must be some deep psychological unity there that's maybe not being revealed in these experiments, and therefore it's tempting to appeal to, like, yeah, again, like a unified phenomenal perspective. But you know, from a, you know, for me, from a theoretical perspective, I think the best we can do is try to look for, you know, the kinds of cognitive and, you know, behavioral actions that we normally take to reflect consciousness and conscious unity. And when we don't find those, just conclude that there's no phenomenal unity after split brain surgery either. But it is, I mean, in a similar way, like you could question whether the left hemisphere was phenomenally conscious, right? But again, we get these like, reports that we think are, require access consciousness, and we assume that where there's access consciousness, there's phenomenal consciousness. But it's always going to remain the case for two separate phenomenal consciousnesses will always remain, I think, or I shouldn't say always, who knows what the future will bring. But at the present, at least, it remains more speculative, harder to pin down than the claim that there are two access conscious perspectives.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Tom.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well. Yeah.
Okay, I will try to. Yeah, no, the microphone is not so good. So this will be like a super low-key question, I guess. But when I was listening to it, I was thinking about those conversations you had with your undergrads, or you had when you were very young, about like, oh, when you realize like, oh, I cannot feel your pain, or I cannot feel your, the warmth of the sun like as it is for you, and you discover solipsism. It's like a huge philosophical discovery when you're like 15 or something. Could you say that in those cases actually the thinkers, if we don't want to say that they are different persons, but if the thinkers have access to that you could say that the lefty feels the righty's pain if the pain is in an overlapping
Right.
part of the body. And then we could say that it's actually not like a necessary truth. It is sometimes possible to feel someone else's pain. Yeah,
great. I mean, and I will say this, there's been a resurgence of papers on this recently, not because of the split brain phenomenon, but because of the conjoined twins, Krista and Tatiana Hogan, who are joined at the level of the thalamus. And there's some, suggestive evidence that they may be able to share experiences in some sense. So, it gets complicated. But, just to give you an example, like there's some suggestive evidence that if one twin closes her eyes, but it looks as though if the other twin is looking at something, the one whose eyes are closed can say what the other is looking at, like the object that's being held up in front of her. And it's not clear whether that's just because like, oh, do they share eyes or do they share in virtue of sharing a thalamus, or is it the actual visual experience in the first twin's brain that is necessary for the second twin to have the visual experience? But people have started writing about that. Peter Langland Hassan has a paper like that where he says like, look, it turns out, right, you can experience other people's you can have and introspect other people's experiences too. That is not I don't see what would ever, I think the Hogan case is even messier than the split brain case, or this makes it even less plausible than the split brain case. There's another example of the Hogan twins where one of them liked ketchup and the other doesn't. But the one who doesn't, when her twin would eat ketchup, she would kind of start to cry and try to scrape it off her own tongue. So in some sense, there I think it becomes clear, like, do you really want to say there's a shared gustatory experience there, right? If one of them is having like a positive response to it and the other's having a negative response to it, I don't really know. But I mean, prima facie, I think, no, I don't see what I would prefer to say in this case is that we have, at most like shared types of experience. And again, that they are shared by some, directly, right? Not by, one of them seeing what the other saw, but because one of them had the experience she did. But it's still the second twin's experience, right? That she is having, not the first twin's experience. In virtue of her having it, it's her experience. At least, that's the conservative option. And I don't see what could really move me beyond that. So where there's an experience, like every experience is the experience of someone, and to the extent, now this is easier in the conjoined twin case than the split brain case, admittedly, but to the extent you have reason to believe in distinct psychological subjects, to that very extent you have reason to believe in distinct experiences, right? That again are maybe like unusually intimately causally linked, right? And perhaps experiences of the same type, right? With the same content and so on. But, given the ways they'll be like incorporated into totally different psychologies, I mean, again, as the ketchup case makes clear, you know, I think you could try to say what you're saying, but I don't see how anyone would be forced to accept that, as opposed to just thinking, no, separate subject, separate experience. I can know, you know, one twin can know what the other is seeing in virtue of having her own experience, but I don't know how different that is from the ordinary case either, right? Like, if I'm feeling really freezing cold in an environment, I can infer that you are feeling really cold too, and that inference might not be secure, but I think we make a lot of judgments about what other people are experiencing based on our own experiences.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome.
Shaheen, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm here with my partner. When we have the same question, two subjects, same question. So we're wondering, what are the implications for regular people, neurotypical people, in terms of like our conscious experience?
Yeah.
For example, the the conflicts between the two hands. Does that go away when the corpus callosum is there? Does that get manifested in a different way?
Yeah.
Or is there equivalent experience that we have that corresponds to that? You know, and yeah. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, thank you. It's an important question, because a lot of philosophers and some neuropsychologists too have argued or assumed that you know, the answer we give to the how many minds question for split brain subjects it constrains and is constrained by the answer we want to give for neurotypical subjects. And I think this intuition, people have this particularly in the case of consciousness. So Nagel, you know, in one of his, in his 1979 paper that kind of like introduced the split brain phenomenon to the philosophical world, one of his objections to the two minds claim, and he treats minds and centers of consciousness like interchangeably in the paper. One of his objections is, you know, he says, if we say that they have two centers of consciousness or two minds, why not say that, you know, each of us has 10 or 20? And he seems to mean something like, if there's consciousness here and consciousness there, and that means two consciousnesses, well, we know that there's consciousness here too, and visual portions of the brain, and then maybe the, like, auditory consciousness is somewhere else and so on. So what's to stop us from arbitrarily, I mean, it's, and I don't even think he thinks it's arbitrary. He seems to be thinking that, like, the basis for our saying that a split brain subject had two consciousnesses would be that there are these two systems, each of which is sufficient for conscious experience. But there are all these dissociable systems within us that are maybe also sufficient for conscious experience. I mean, in a minimum, there are also, you know, the two hemispheres, right, are dissociable and each sufficient for conscious experience. But I don't understand why, I just don't think that what we say of the neurotypical case is constrained by what we say of the split brain case in this way. I mean, the case for thinking that there are two distinct consciousnesses after split brain surgery, you know, totally involves these claims about how conscious events in each hemisphere appear to interact or be isolated from each other. And you don't have the same kind of isolation in the neurotypical case. Now, that is not to say that neurotypical consciousness is necessarily perfectly unified. Yeah, there are experimental results. You know, Marcel has a very famous and interesting paper, you know, seeming to maybe show certain kinds of dissociations within neurotypical subjects' conscious experience too. And, you know, I'm sure there's a ton of results like this, right? But I think that what's different about the split brain case from the neurotypical case is that, you know, yeah, you might have this kind of, instead of like this perfectly unified set in the neurotypical case, it might be that, you know, then there's this, you know, this one experience which is unified with a bunch of them, but not unified with the rest. And here's this other experience which is only unified with a couple of them. And, you know, so you might have that kind of messiness, but the rough form is still unitary, right? You don't have, it's not the case that the, you know, I want to talk about this in terms of like, you know, network analysis or something like, you know, it's what's different about the split brain case is that you seem to have these two unities, right? And maybe neither of them is perfectly unified either. right? There can be some, you know, kind of only partially unified experiences in each of those sets too. But that's really different from the, you know, neurotypical case, in which it does appear to be true that, you know, there is, you know, more unity across the hemispheres than there are disunities, right, across the hemispheres. So again, it's not to say that neurotypical consciousness is necessarily perfectly unified, just that it doesn't appear to be significantly dissociated along hemispheric lines, right? So if you had to talk about kind of like the rough shape of consciousness in a neurotypical subject, it would be like, you know, like a single ball, even if it was kind of a fuzzy ball, again, because there were some experiences on the periphery which only had some degree of unity with the others. Whereas again, like if you had to talk about the shape of consciousness in split brain subjects, it would be, you know, two balls, even if there were, you know, some overlap between them or something like that.
Sorry, to be clear, are you saying that after the split brain surgery, the two hemispheres start doing completely different things as they compared to before? Because I was assuming that like the person who's having the conflict with the newspaper, right? The left hand keeps, you know, throwing away. I was assuming that a neurotypical person, the same signal would come from the two hemispheres, but would get merged at some point. And so you wouldn't see the conflict in the hands, but the conflict would get resolved somewhere earlier or something. Or am I wrong in assuming that that conflict just never arises in a neurotypical person? There are not different signals coming from the different hemispheres.
Yeah, well, I mean, that case might be a little special because presumably, you know, presumably the reason why several split brain subjects report this is like the right hemisphere probably can't read. You know, whereas, so that particular conflict isn't going to, you know, arise in a neurotypical subject, but I think it's probably true that, yes, you can have, I mean, look, forget hemispheres. We all know what it's like to be torn between two different things or to feel ambivalent, right? Or to, you know, want to do one thing, but we have this competing thing we want to do and we can't do both and so on. And yeah, I mean, I think the difference is those, you know, we can recognize the conflict and the ambivalence, right? In fact, it feels like ambivalence, right? There's something that it feels like to feel torn between two things or to know that you should do something and to want it in that sense, but to like really not feel like it. And that's what's totally lacking in the reading case. There's actually an interesting, I mentioned that some of the cases I talk about in the book are these cases of organic callosal damage. And there's, you know, there's this interesting series of cases from Japan in which the anterior callosum suffered more, the front parts of the corpus callosum suffered more damage than the rear parts. Now this is interesting because people also do partial split brain surgeries. And what they do in that case is they section the back portion and they leave the front portion connected, because then you have less competing behaviors, i.e. the portions that connect more motor and planning portions of the brain are left intact and you just disconnect some of the sensory perceptual stuff. These organic cases, it's the opposite, right? The sensory perceptual stuff and like, you know, various other kind of memory functions and so on are left connected, but you've damaged to these frontal portions that connect areas of the brain that are more associated with agency. And what you see with these patients, I mean, the person who talks about them calls the phenomenon conflict of intentions. Although originally it was called diagonistic dyspraxia in the split brain literature, but unfortunately that, you know, although it was originally coined to refer to this sort of phenomenon, it came to be used to refer basically just to intermanual conflict, which is not what these patients experienced. These Japanese patients experienced, you know, being struck by two contrary and competing intentions, two inconsistent intentions, like, you know, wanting to go upstairs and grab something, but also wanting to go downstairs and grab something from the basement. And they would be unable to resolve this conflict, with the result that, you know, a patient might stop for 20 minutes on the staircase, wanting to go up and wanting to go down and unable to choose between those. Now that's like not, you know, I've had people joke sometimes like, oh, I do that, but I don't think people really do that. Does it take 20 minutes to decide like which to go up and go down first? But, you know, this is a case, this is like, in this case, you seem to have some of the same kind of difficulty resolving competing intentions prior to actual action. I mean, again, sitting on the left hand counts as a resolution in some sense, just maybe one person's not so happy about it, but it is a way of resolving the conflict. But, you know, so they, similar to these split brain subjects, they have difficulty resolving the conflict prior to any actual overt action. But the difference is that because they're not fully split, they are at least aware of having conflicting intentions. Again, that's what's missing in the split brain case. It makes it really difficult from the neurotypical case, right? There shouldn't be feelings of ambivalence in this case. And indeed, like, they don't report that. They never report saying, well, I wanted to do this, but I also wanted to reach for that. Or, you know, well, you know, part of me wanted to say that I didn't see anything, but I also kind of felt as though I had said something or whatever, right? That's that kind of, you know, again, like introspective access to like both of these conflicting sets of mental states is missing. And again, I think that's really different from the neurotypical case. I mean, of course, you're right, there are conflicts, but intrapersonal conflict is just really different from interpersonal conflict, right? So it is, I think, a significant difference, right? And we have, you know, strategies we can bring to bear on, you know, again, when we do feel torn between two courses of action or ambivalent about some state of affairs or something. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Colleen.
Yeah, thanks. This is all really interesting. And I just have to point out to Brian Keeley that you don't have to be in Southern California to be sitting outside and enjoying the weather today. Come January, he may have a different argument. But some of what I want to say follows up a bit from this, and I'm interested in tying two things.
Hold on. I think I made a mistake. I moved Liz to.
Oh, okay.
I'm moving her back. It's going to take a second.
All right. Okay. Yeah.
All right, Liz, I apologize. I moved you by accident. All these buttons. Can you start again, Colleen?
Yeah, you can hear me now, right? Good. Yeah, Edward just didn't want you to hear my question, I think. But, yeah, split brains. Anyway, I want to link two things. One is degree of lateralization in other things than vision and audition particularly. So I think I picked up from things that you've said already, which is the right brain doesn't know what the left hand is doing, or what the right hand is doing, or vice versa, right? So, so in the short term, there's no information about what's going on. And these experiments are also describe the short-term integration. But then I'm also curious about what happens, not just in this sort of peripheral sensory sense, but in memory formation, because I think I know that the hippocampus is lateralized, but I think I also understand that it's not lateralized in a way that maps directly onto lateralization in the hemispheres. And so the curious thought occurs to me that maybe the two thinkers, if we accept your view, right, have access to first a store of memories that were formed before the hemispherectomy equally, right? And secondly, might end up getting memories of things that happened on the other side after a suitable amount of, you know, typical memory consolidation process. So is there any research or anything relevant to that issue? And you're muted still.
It hasn't been looked at as much as it should have been, but it appears, I mean, I have to say, first of all, to say that there's no awareness of what the other hand is doing is too strong. I mean, it really depends upon, a lot. So, you know, there's some ability to like feel the other hand, right? Actually not bad ability to feel the other hand, at least for certain kinds of experiences and so on. But again, one hemisphere might not be paying attention to what the other hemisphere is doing. Partly like they got better behavior out of split brain subjects, less interference from lefty when they would give the subject some other meaningless task to be doing with the right hand simultaneously. So, you know, I just want to say there's a lot of complications there in terms of what's shared, but I think what, you know, the important question is the memory question. Yes, so far as I can tell, no, there's no long-term, I talk about that in the book actually, because it seems as though it would be possible for, yeah, a split brain subject to initially say, yeah, I didn't, you know, see anything on the left, and then like a week later or something, say, you know, now it's beginning to seem to me as though like actually it was a dollar sign on the left or something like that. But that does not appear to happen. So the hippocampus, my understanding is that the hippocampus is also sectioned during corpus callosum surgery just because of its placement relative to the corpus callosum. a lot of the earliest the earliest split brain experiments were these animal experiments, and these were learning experiments, right? Where you would, teach an animal to make one, in that case, the optic chiasm was section 2. So that was nice, because that means like the right hemisphere projects only to the right eye only to the right hemisphere, the left eye onto the left hemisphere. And you would just have an animal like learn a perceptual discrimination with a single eye and a single hemisphere, and then just test whether any of it transferred to the other hemisphere, and it wouldn't, even over, these weren't, I assume this was over a somewhat long period of time, just given what, animal testing experiment is like. And you hear the same thing, only anecdotally. I don't know if anyone who's studied this, but, Sperry says like, yeah, and, the left hemisphere will remain unaware of what the right hemisphere was presented with and what the right hemisphere did, even weeks later, when asked about the testing situation. So at least, over that period of time, no, it doesn't appear to become bilaterally available. Another thing that wasn't tested enough, you mentioned like, oh, presumably both hemispheres have memories of, the same events that happened prior to split brain surgery. And some of that obviously.
Life history, yeah, right.
Yeah, like in some of that, like, you ask the subject about, well, it's a little confusing. You ask the subject about like, their mom or their girlfriend or, work or something like that, even if the subject hasn't worked since getting the surgery. And yes, like both hemispheres can answer those sorts of questions. But I don't know of anyone who's asked for like very specific memories. I don't know of an experiment in which the hemispheres were asked for very specific memories. So I assume that, it would be sort of miraculous if memories before the surgery were totally perfectly shared, but I assume there's a ton of overlap. And I guess I assume that partly because, again, like if you think about hemispherectomy cases, I don't think it's the case that, a human being who's undergone right hemispherectomy, suddenly only remembers half their life or something like that. So I do think they're laid down.
So I was thinking in the normal case, it takes a tachistoscope or the additional surgery on the monkeys to really separate the visual fields, right? So actually, before commissurotomy, you're having, both sides are seeing the bedroom that you had when you were a child or something like this, right? So if you asked left and right hands to draw that bedroom, you ought to get roughly similar performance out of that, you would think.
And of course, outside of experimental conditions, the two hemispheres of a split brain subject will normally see a lot of the same things also, because the eyes, what counts as the central fixation point, is determined by where your eyes are looking, right? And actually split brain subjects make more saccades and more dramatic saccades than neurotypical subjects do. And they think that this is, possibly because it's an attempt to bring more information into both hemispheres. And so, most memories would be, you would need to test them specifically you would need to show them something under an experimental condition. And then weeks later, it would need to be something that you think would be memorable. And then weeks later, I continue to ask the hemisphere that hadn't been shown it. Do you remember that now? Yeah.
Yeah, this makes the book holding case kind of puzzling in a way too, right? So I can see why at the moment, one hemisphere has control of one hand and the other has control of the other. Yeah. But, you and I could hold a book together, even though got no coupling of it. We can both use our visual experience to make that cooperative. So why are these two hemispheres uncooperative in this way? If they're both thinkers and understanding of some kind of task being accomplished here.
Yeah, so in the Ferguson, Rayport, and Corey study, where they observed split brain subjects outside of experimental conditions in their day-to-day lives, they saw a lot of behaviors where like, yeah, the hands would kind of work at cross purposes, or often like, you wouldn't have even known that necessarily from watching, but then the subject would verbally report, well, I went into the refrigerator for one thing, but my left hand grabbed the wrong thing or whatever. And in those cases, it presumably is just, I think what you're seeing there is, two agents, at least, even if the two thinkers claim like two agents in some sense, there are these two centers or sources of agency, and they are no longer communicating prior to behavior because they, again, because the callosal root is missing, and they don't know about the other's existence, so they're also not talking about it in any way. And so, you know, when they're, it seems to me as though when they're engaging in behaviors that are more, can be more like environmentally or perceptually scaffolded, where it's really obvious from seeing what you've started to do, what the next step is and what it is that you're doing, I think they experience fewer problems, right? But when it comes to things that require like any kind of like advanced planning right before you get going in order to do it successfully, they're really impaired. Now the reading case is a little special because in that case you would think, oh yeah, that can be very scaffolded, right? Again, like you pick up a book and hold it to your face, there's only one thing that means, right? That you want to read that book. Now, there are different possible interpretations of this. What neuropsychologists have said is like, oh, well, you know, because saccades are so unusual in split brain subjects, maybe that makes reading unpleasant or difficult. But again, that doesn't seem to be consistent with what the subjects report. The subject doesn't say, I keep trying to read, but it's really hard. And, you know, I can't process. The subject says like, I keep trying to read and my left hand won't let me. Again, that's why I think like, it seems at least relevant that like the right hemisphere has a basically normal vocabulary, but basically no grasp of syntax. And so does not want to read, right? And of course, the right hemisphere, if I'm right, then in the same way the left hemisphere doesn't think of itself as refusing to cooperate or compromise with the right hemisphere thinker, neither does the right hemisphere thinker. The right hemisphere thinker is not thinking, oh, but lefty really wants to read. Fine, I'll do this for half an hour. The right hemisphere keeps thinking, oh, this isn't making any sense, right? And just like throwing the book down on the ground in frustration, the way you would if you know, maybe were, you know, kept thinking you wanted to read and then picking up a book and finding that in fact you couldn't make heads or tails of it.
So if there's time for one more follow-up, Edward, I mean, this goes to some of the claim that there's an I thinker in there, because some people would want to argue that you can't really have a proper concept of I without having concept of the not I or the other as well. And so you know, why would have a blind spot? Because presumably, you know, the talking left hemisphere has perfect ability to talk about the mental states of others around. Why is there this sort of blind spot when it comes to what the other half of its own brain is doing?
Yeah, and this is what I mean when I say that, you know, that they lack the capacity relative to each other in some way, right? Because again, you're right, like either of them can distinguish, well, it's not clear if you want to say itself or the split brain human being as a whole from all other people. I mean, the blind spot, I think, is the product of the fact that they are co-embodied to such a great degree, right? Like they do not share that body with anyone else. And so it is easy for them to distinguish, again, like either themselves or the split brain human being as a whole from all other people. But this is a being with whom, right? I mean, there's like one pair of eyes in the mirror, and each of them has some degree of control over every part of the body and receives some, you know, sensory perceptual experience from every part of the body. And I'm wondering even if like that feeling, that phenomenology of a body being mine, there might be something inherently kind of exclusionary in it that like for it to feel like, yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah. Sorry, this reminds me of the Metzinger experiments, right? So you set it up so that there's a dummy hand moving in conjunction with somebody's actual hand, but they can only see the dummy hand. And or you put a camera behind them, they come to have an out-of-body experience. So they actually locate themselves in this thing. And so maybe, yes, it's so tightly coordinated at the bodily level that they can't actually pull themselves out of that. The illusion of being me is there.
Yeah. And I mean, well, in a sense, of course, and in a sense, it's not even entirely illusory. Like every part of righty's body is lefty, right? I mean, and I think that's what makes it so hard. It's really just the psychology, right, and the actions that are distinct. And, you know, I have to say, it's funny because when I've spoken to philosophers, there must be some kind of like, maybe we can use this for like personality testing or something. Like opinions are very different, right? Some people say, you know, oh, I would know if I were split brains up, like if I, you know, if my right hemisphere started acting like that, I would figure it out pretty quickly, right? That there was someone else in there. And other philosophers, and I think I'm kind of on this latter page, are like, I can't imagine what I would have to see in order for me to conclude that there was that anything was happening other than like, shoot, I can't control my left hand. My left hand doesn't work that well anymore. And, you know, these are people who, keep in mind, they have a long history of having experiences of being radically out of control of their bodies and what they do, right? Because of their seizure histories. And, you know, that might play into it too, right? That they're just used to, yeah, like having things not quite work right.
All right. Thank you, Colleen. I think we're almost out of time, and there is no one on the queue anyway. So I'll take a certain opportunity to follow up on Colleen's question, because I think there's, you know, there's tons of, well, there's a few other syndromes, that is a few, which are similar and interestingly different from the one you're looking at. I mean, one of them is obviously multiple personality disorder. Now, it's a controversial disorder. It's a little bit unclear how real it is, but supposing it is real, at least in some cases of psychosis, you might think it is a real phenomenon, where actually people do believe that there is someone else in them, and nonetheless they don't have the external cues. Well, except maybe the body not under control, but the cue seems to be quite similar to the type of cues that someone with a split brain following a split brain surgery would have. And so I'm a little bit unclear what the contrast between these two cases, how to understand the contrast between these two cases. Similarly, another type of cases that seems to be syndrome that seems to be relevant is foreign limb syndrome, which is a very rare syndrome, but you have people who believe that one of their limb is not their own limb because they have random movements that they can't control. Now, they view that as not part of their own body and as controlled by something else. Why isn't that happening in the case of split brain patients? You would think it should be happening at least sometimes. So what are the differences between all those cases?
So I think you called it did you call it foreign limb?
Yeah, foreign limb syndrome, yeah.
That's interesting. Is it like anarchic hand or alien hand syndrome?
Yeah, it is related to alien limb syndrome. It might be more general, but I think alien limb syndrome is sometimes one of the way of calling it.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, again, the wrong person.
I'm here.
Yes. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Somehow, whenever I'm trying to move someone to attend, the order changes. I think that's been a few mishaps.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding of, I mean, I think there are probably a couple different deficits going on in alien hand or foreign limb syndrome, but one of the deficits is a kind of sensory deficit. That you are no longer getting that kind of sensory feedback from the arm, and so the arm literally doesn't feel like yours. Now, of course, presumably something else has to be going on to have the delusion that it isn't yours, right? Because people can lose sensation in a limb and still say, must be mine, it's attached to my shoulder or whatever. So there must be a secondary deficit too, but you know, there is this primary sensory deficit that I think is not missing in split brain subjects. And also I would say relative to a lot of, I mean, my view is that relative to a lot of other neuropsychological populations, yeah, I mean, they're pretty rational, right? And they, you know, there doesn't seem to be, I would say that some people say that if lefty doesn't recognize righty and there really is a different mind there, then that is a kind of agnosignosia. I reject that. I don't think, you know, a lot of people think it's impossible for there to be two minds in one body. So it's hard to say why lefty would be rationally compelled, right, to believe that there were two minds, right, in its own body. So yeah, but I think and you know, anarchic hand syndrome too, there are, again, like different, you know, in that case, there is callosal damage, but there are also damages to, you know, motor cortex. And again, in the split brain case, because this is a surgery, right, rather than, again, the consequence of, you know, like a stroke or something like that, you know, they're only cutting through this white matter pathway connecting the two cerebral hemispheres. And actually, you know, the package within each hemisphere is left complete. Now, dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder is trickier, and it's trickier partly because, as you said, it's not so much that it's controversial, but it's just much more difficult to understand. One of the nice things about the split brain phenomenon is that, you know, at least like the cause of it is like very simple to understand, right? There's such a simple explanation, and you also aren't getting, in a sense, unusual reports from either hemisphere. You're not getting reports from the right hemisphere at all, but reports from the left hemisphere are limited, right? So it's not reporting what's going on in the right hemisphere, what we can infer is going on in the right hemisphere, but reports of left hemisphere experience are basically very normal, at least in the American subjects that I'm primarily focused on. Dissociative identity disorder, you're right, is almost the reverse of the split brain case, because on the one hand, these different alters or identities don't appear to be dissociated from each other to the extent that they are in split brain subjects. And that's unsurprising, since there is no basic physical functional disconnectivity. On the other hand, what you do have is reports of being distinct identities in some cases, and a phenomenology of being different. So, I mean, this is very speculative. But remember I said, in the ordinary case, introspection doesn't provide the basis for self-distinction because we can't introspect other people's mental states. It's almost as though, again, and it's very hard to generalize about this very heterogeneous population, but my impression is that in DID, there are these, what people focus on is the dissociations, the amnesia and so on. But also what they have is they have these experiences of, like, one alter will have these experiences of being present in the body and even kind of knowing what the intentions are guiding the body's movement, but feeling alienated from them in some way. And again, so there's a kind of shared access there, but the phenomenology is really disrupted somehow, right? There's a sense of actions feeling not like mine. Mm-hmm. So in the same case, you just don't have this, you seem not to just have this basic phenomenological access. So if you were going to conclude that there was another agent there, it would have to be on the basis of behavioral evidence. Mm-hmm. And I think that's our stereotype of how people with DID come to recognize each other's, these different identities and alters. But from my reading, that's true in the movie cases more than it is true in the actual cases. Yeah.
That's super cool. I think we're going to stop here for today's meeting. Thank you very much. It's been really a fascinating lecture. And some of the fellows and I will see you a little bit later. I think we should take a 15-minute break and just
cool.
refresh yourself. And we'll meet very briefly in 15 minutes.
Great, thank you.
Right. Thank you very much again for this amazing lecture on behalf of all the attendees. And I'll talk to you later.
All right,
Bye.
talk to you soon. Bye.